the great and good, and the great and good were involved in slavery. So it was the heart of the British economy, British social life was reflected in the art, which was much of it was funded by slave money. Here's another quote I want to share with you. This is a more recent quote from some people who did some work on slavery and its effect on the Industrial Revolution. And they talk about each slave trade voyage had a multiplier effect throughout the local economy because investments were spread across many individuals, including attorneys, drapers, ropers, grocers, tallow chandlers, farmers, tailors, who had a financial interest, shared the risk and reaped the rewards. It was a multiplier effect throughout the economy. It was fundamental to the economy. It made it work. It was part of the economy. And we can see that later on when we're talking about the so-called slavery compensation database people were paying when the slave trade was abolished, they were given money. And you can see that over 40,000 people were given money, compensation. Those 40,000 people, there were widows in Penzance, vicars up in Glasgow. It was a wide part of the community. It was, as I said earlier, it's systemic. It's part of Britain's way of life. And I share this picture only because, for two reasons. One, I like the picture, and I think it's one of the earliest pictures which has a hint of abolitionism, and certainly showing some of the pain. You know, it's called the exertable traffic, human traffic, or the affectionate slaves. The fact that these were families being torn apart. It was shown here. This was an early depiction of that. But really, we have to go back to where the slave trade started. And one of the things I do in my period is the Renaissance. And the Renaissance, in Britain, there was no slaves. And that moves on to Stuart times and Georgian times. I mean, the belief was the air was too free, too fresh for one to be a slave. But at the same time, Britain wrote the most heinous, the most brutal slave code in the colonies, and it was copied by in the southern states of America. And this is like a quote from it. It was a heathenish, I'm talking about the states, a heathenish, brutish, and uncertain, dangerous pride of people, whose nature required that they should be subject to rigorous and punishatory laws, So that was the way people could be distant. Violence was built into the code. And in doing so, what the British did, British in particular, they created what Cedric Robertson calls, he didn't call it, but he looks at the Negro. It talks about the Negro having no civilization, no culture, no religion, no history, no place, and finally, no humanity that might command consideration. And this is important here because you actually dehumanize people. You create commodities. You create the Negro as a commodity. So then this is something you can buy, you can sell, you can lease, you can rent, you can mortgage, you can inherit. It's an object, it's a thing. And that in some ways is the trick, the magic of the slave trade, the trade in slave people, because you're not dealing with human beings. I must admit, I was doing some work with Lloyd's, and you can get not consumed but overtaken by just lists of 500 slaves here, 200 slaves here, and you can see how one can lose the idea of humanity. These were brothers and sisters, they were fathers, these were farmers, metal workers, humanity. But what creating the Negro does, it takes away all that humanity. And you can sometimes say some people buy, sell, lease, rent, mortgage, or even inherit. And the nucleus of the slave trade was the so-called mercantile slave. Mercantile trade. What was that? This was the idea that your wealth was about gold, it was gold bullion, and you exported, you didn't import anything. Export was what it was all about. So the triangular trade was the heart of the slave trade. It was really an excellent example of how you imported, you exported. So you took finished goods, textiles, guns, and the like, and you took them to Africa and you traded them for slaves. And then you took those slaves to the Americas, to the Caribbean, and you sold them. And you brought back goods, the goods from the Caribbean. And then you could sell into Europe, you could export them again. So it was a really important part, essential part, as I said, of the economy. But one thing I'd like to share with you, I think is really important, we don't lose sight. So I'd like to humanize when I talk on slavery, because it's so easy to forget, create this idea of Negro. If we look at how the trade worked, now the captured and the green, there's 100 slaves who were captured, and slaves were captured in many ways, in wars, villages, they were stolen, but they were captured from Africa. And they were traded by Africans to white people. And in capturing those slaves, something like 5% died en route to the coast. 5% died. So about 195 made it to the coast. Okay? And then the example here is Bunce Island. Bunce Island was an island off Africa, Syria, where they would hold the slaves enslaved in ships, sometimes up to 3 months, while they were collecting enough to make a voyage worthwhile. And up to 30% would die without crossing the Atlantic. 30%. Such was the attrition, because they were packed in on these ships. On these ships were off, or in the hold of the prisoners. 10, 15, 30 men pressed into a small space. So at least 30 would die. Leaving 67. Then on the Middle Passage, 12 to 13% would die or commit suicide by jumping overboard. So by 58 made it to the Americas. 58. And after 3 years, 30%, 50% had gone. So you're talking about 17 to 26 actually made it after 3 years. 17 from 100. Such is the attrition of those businesses. I find that both hurtful, astonishing, and really sad, because it speaks to how they did create this thing called the Negro. They could dehumanize it to the extent that, and this is what Hilary Beckles, will be talking more about later, he talks about the average life was 7 years. Because there were no old slaves. Because old slaves, there was no money in old slaves, so they were cast away, they were done away with, literally. So this is really a death sentence. A death sentence in action, you can see in that chart there of death.